Sujit, what does Canada's history with emergencies legislation tell us about how these types of laws are used and why we should be so careful about them?
So the predecessor to the Emergencies Act was the War Measures Act, and the War Measures Act was actually a series of statutes that was in force in Canada from 1914 until that regime was replaced with the Emergencies Act in 1988. And the abuse of executive power by the federal cabinet under the War Measures Act was one of the darkest moments in Canadian history. So it was the War Measures Act that was the legal basis for the internment of Japanese Canadians during the Second World War. It was the War Measures Act that was the legal basis for the internment of Italian Canadians during the Second World War. And then it was also the War Measures Act that was the basis for the abuse of emergency powers by the Trudeau government under Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau in 1970 in the wake of the FLQ crisis. And in all those cases, when we look back at them after the moment of panic, we realized that governments had overreacted. They'd not taken the narrowest means necessary to address legitimate public policy goals. They had violated people's rights. They'd engaged in horrendous racial discrimination, and they'd used the powers for purposes that they were never intended to be used. So, for example, with respect to the FLQ crisis, these powers were used to attack union leaders, who had nothing to do with the threat in Quebec. And so the Emergencies Act was drafted as a deliberate response to that dark legacy in very narrow terms. And it's incumbent upon the courts to interpret those terms strictly because of the history of the abuse of emergency powers in this country to ensure that those sorts of abuses never happen again.
So important that we learn from our history. Janani, one of the areas of the use of the Emergencies Act that really has struck a lot of people as overbroad were some of these financial measures, the freezing of accounts, the measures that allowed the government to disclose otherwise private banking information to the police. And the CCF is arguing that this is a charter infringement. So what can you tell me about that?
So Section 8 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees that we have a right to unreasonable search and seizure. And banks have very intimate personal information about us, how we spend our money, how much money we have in our accounts. And what the emergencies legislation allows is for the economics regulation, what it allows for is for financial institutions to pass on these intimate information about us to the authorities, to FinTrack, to other different kinds of police powers. And, the charter guarantees that we should be free from unreasonable search and seizure. And here, there is no authorization that's required before the banks pass this information on. There's no guidance for what does one have to do in order for that information to be passed on. So it's a real concern that we have with the way that the regulations have been drafted.
And that disclosure would constitute a search. So one of the things there's been so much commentary on, Janani, is that the Emergencies Act states at the beginning of it that it's subject to the charter. So a lot of people, I've seen pundits say this, that what has happened isn't a violation of civil liberties because the Emergencies Act is subject to the charter. So this analysis is all wrong, but briefly, can you explain what's wrong with it?
So every law in Canada is subject to the charter, and it's not enough to just have a rubber stamp that says approved by the charter as though it's some sort of approval that everything is going to be consistent with the charter. Our role as lawyers in this litigation is to ensure that it's not just them saying it's subject to the charter, but actually when you break it down, is it truly in accordance with the charter, and is it going to pass the muster of the Constitution?
Yeah, I mean, if the rule was that every piece of legislation and every government action says it's charter compliant, if that made it charter compliant, we would never have a charter violation. We've got to go to commercial break in a second, but what I wanted to raise in the next segment is the issue that the Emergencies Act has been revoked. It was voted on in Parliament. It was confirmed, Emergencies Act, the emergency powers were confirmed by Parliament. But then 2 days later, the Prime Minister turned around and revoked the emergency. And I want to talk about what impact that is going to have on the case, and whether or not that shows that this might have been quite a politicized decision. We've got to go to break, but we'll be right back.